Hey students, Mr. Imatsu here, coming with activity number 7, Civil Rights Movement Part 3, moving through the 60s and 70s kind of ish, I think. Yeah, that's about there. One thing I keep on thinking, especially, from our conversation 2 days ago about how this like AP European history, our conversation yesterday about how, going through the presidents. One really cool movie that can really help you guys through this is actually Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump takes place, if you don't know about this, it takes place probably in about the late 50s. He goes to the Vietnam War. He participates in the Vietnam protests. He participates in the civil rights movements. He learns about the assassination of JFK and all these other items. So all of this kind of time, like a really cool movie to watch is Forrest Gump. Now, I'll warn you, it's about 2.5 hours long, so or 3 hours long. I mean, it seems a pretty darn long thing. Another thing he does is sorry to go back, but he plays ping pong with China, which kind of shows our like opening up to China, even though it's a communist state, and we have obviously, at least trading wise, very strong ties today. Anyways, just interesting if you want to watch this video after this or maybe before it to give you some context about how things are happening and when they're happening. Yeah, it's a pretty cool way to watch the watch history, and I think it's a really cool historical video and movie right now that would really help you tie these kind of so many moving events that are happening outside the United States and inside the United States at the same time. Very, I don't know. I think life is just tumultuous in general. So, but it was definitely a tumultuous time. All right, so check it out. This activity, we're going to be continuing our focus on civil rights. We've moved from Rosa Parks, who thrusted this guy Martin Luther King to become a little bit more famous, and he's going to kind of lead a little bit more of the civil rights movement, as we already know. And he had a different ideal than some others that we'll talk about later. Remember that Martin Luther King will lead this march called later called the Million Man March. I think they called this the March on Washington, and it was really for economic focus. Is really an idea of economic rather than political rights, and kind of that has been a center part of actually the African American right movement in general. Should we focus on our economics? Should we focus on political? What should we focus the most on? And this one starts as kind of a one for economics, kind of unifying more people, right, rather than just being a singular focused like African American cause. And in this case, just like what we saw in the Black Lives Matter movements, there are one really important thing is there's a lot of white individuals are participating in this movement as well. Really showing their advocacy and support for this movement and the integration and the desegregation and more of the economic justice that Martin Luther King was focused on. Martin Luther King, as we know, is a famous individual because of his focus on peaceful, nonviolent protest. And what's interesting is he kind of brings that back to Mahatma Gandhi, which did a peaceful protest. I mean, most famously is Salt March, in which Britain was taxing them for salt. So he just simply went to the ocean and created his own salt tax free and gave it to the people. So that's one way in which he protested. A very interesting part of Indian history if you want to check it out. But also Henry David Thoreau. And we know Henry David Thoreau. He was the writer. He's a transcendentalist who actually was in jail because he refused to pay taxes because he thought the Mexican-American War was unjust. And his way of civil disobedience and protest was for him not to pay it. And that was his nonviolence. So he really looks at these as his figures towards nonviolent protest. This is going to differ with a man called Malcolm X. Malcolm X is going to adopt a more violent, more radical view of it. Him and then later the Black Panthers will have a more direct confrontational view and almost a way to even like segregate themselves away from white society and pretty much focus only on themselves, which is kind of an interesting view. Just one kind of interesting about Malcolm X, he's jailed, I believe, for burglary, and during this time he like reads and almost memorizes the entire dictionary. So he becomes a very well-spoken man. And he's definitely a criticism of Martin Luther's approach towards achieving this justice. He believes it should be done in a more direct, confrontational, and even violent way. So, one event that happens is something called Bloody Sunday, in which there was a march that was going down, and the police basically cracked down on the protesters. And again, unfortunately, we have seen this type of activity recently in multiple levels. But in this protest right here, what you'll see is this is actually John Lewis, and this is a photograph of John Lewis, and I'll tell you who John Lewis becomes later. But in this photograph, he is a marcher that marched in the front with Martin Luther King side by side and was attacked. This police officer hit him in the head and actually fractured his skull. I mean, could have almost killed him. And he actually has he had obviously a wound on his head for his whole life from that event. John Lewis today, he recently passed. He was voted in as a senator, and as a senator, he participated and focused a lot for the Democratic Party, especially on voting rights. That was one of his goals, and that's something that the current Democratic Congress is looking to pass and enforce even more. But I just want to show you, because one of his last actual public appearances, I believe he died of actually cancer. He was fighting cancer. But one of his last public appearances was actually at the newly minted Black Lives Matter road out lane, I don't know, in Washington, D.C., which has that. So, it's kind of cool that this guy, came from this experience and actually got involved in politics and moved it forward. So, one interesting moment at this time that we would like to think about is like what the heck is happening to these two parties, right? There's this kind of moment that's happening, and it really comes from this kind of segregationist view. So if you're looking like 1896 and you think of the word Democrats, you think, oh my gosh, it's all Southerners, right? The Democrats were the Confederates, right? That was the party that succeeded during the Civil War, and largely slave owners, right? And so how are Democrats today now like John Lewis, right? These African Americans, like how did that switch? Basically, it happens during this time as down here in the Democrats areas, like more and more African Americans are being able to vote, and they're voting in for Democratic candidates. And as they begin voting in for Democratic candidates, some of these Democratic candidates actually have to start appealing towards African Americans. And so as they begin appealing towards African Americans, some of the white Southerners reject this and say, okay, fine, I'm no longer being a Democrat, and they begin voting Republican. And today, the South is largely a Republican voting base, right? So just that's what kind of happens at this time. I'm not trying to say that today at this time, I could see that this could be misconstrued, that today at this time, all Republicans are considered Southern racists. I mean, obviously that's not true, right? The Republicans are of the party. But what does happen at this time, just to be clear, is that a lot of African Americans are having more rights to vote, and a lot of white Southerners, those with Southern feelings, with white superiority, segregationist views, they're voting overwhelmingly more Republican and aligning themselves to the Republican Party at this time. So that's kind of shows you the switch right there. Lastly, a last group that we'll be discussing again, and something that Malcolm X would agree upon and actually works with, is a group called the Black Panther Party. The Black Panthers definitely had a more confrontational, more direct and violent view of perhaps asserting African American rights. They kind of had a focus of, it's very interesting, of like just helping themselves, So they would fund Black schools, they would fund like food distributions, they would kind of organize for community efforts for the African American community. In a lot of states that they have, they had open carry in arms. They would go ahead and walk around with their open carry arms and just make sure, and kind of have that more militant view. What's interesting here in California, I guess our open carry laws, like you can openly have a revolver walking around, was actually ended because of the Black Panther Party. So we wrote legislation to get rid of you can just carry an open weapon, a gun at any time. So that's kind of a local history of what happened with the Black Panthers here. All right, guys. So as you can see, this idea of racism, this idea of segregation, man, it has a long, deep, and complicated history. And we're still retching ourselves from that history today, as you guys definitely know. So I'm glad that you guys understand and appreciate it, because once you understand and appreciate it, you can understand the complexities of it all. So, all right, guys, we'll continue on to our next one, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care. Hope that's helpful. Bye.